will be available on ISACA Istanbul chapter YouTube account. Second, please take your time to complete a post-webinar survey that will be sent into the chat window. Third, you can type your questions throughout the session. Also, time will be allocated in the end, so our speaker Mark will address your questions. And the great part, Mark will share his slides at the end of this webinar. Now it's time. I would love to introduce you our presenter for this evening. It gives me pleasure to welcome Mark Thomas. Mark Thomas is international known governance, risk and compliance expert specializing in information assurance, IT risk, IT strategy, service management, and digital transformation. And also I noticed that he's a former army officer like I am. Over 28 years of professional experience, Mark has a wide array of industry experience, including government, healthcare, finance, manufacturing, and technology. Now, Mark, you can begin.
Let's get this thing started. I want to thank you very much for having me with the chapter. And I mentioned in a I think it was a Twitter or a LinkedIn post that I have not been to Turkey since 1992. This is my first chance to at least try to get there virtually. I do have many friends out there. One notable friend of mine who's been a colleague of mine for several years is Kaya. And I see Kaya's out on this call. So any question that Kaya asks, I'm probably going to not answer that because he's going to try to put me in a corner, I think. You know, I'm teasing you, Kaya, out there, but thank you. Thanks again, guys, for having me. But I think this is a very, very hot topic right now. Hey, everybody, things are going very fast. High velocity IT is a hot topic these days. And I believe that having a good governance, risk, and compliance framework is extremely key to be able to doing that. You know, you stack that on top of things like digital transformation, the huge proliferation of Internet of Things. It requires a new IT investments, and with that introduces new risks. So I think it's really important that you have a very solid GRC or governance framework that allows you to be able to audit these your activities within the IT organization. And an important piece of this is to be able to balance what I call performance and conformance. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So you see my eyes going back and forth. I'm trying to keep an eye out on the chat window here. So if you have any questions, throw it out on the chat now, and I'll try to address your questions as we walk through this. That way I can answer them as we're on the topic that we're talking about. So speaking of topics, go really quick on this because I really want to jump into the meat of what I wanted to tell you guys today. So we're going to understand the differences, the benefits, risks between what we call fast and slow IT. Now, they're both required. We'll look at GRC frameworks, and you know me, I am going to be talking about COBIT. I don't have a single conversation where COBIT doesn't come out of my mouth. Now, I did not say COVID, I said COBIT. So, and then we're going to really look at how you might be able to create a body of assurance, you know, and make this an auditable type of framework for you. So here's the key things that I want to share with you guys today. And we're going to start with what we call transforming environments. And what I wanted to do is just really set up the story for high velocity IT. And so what is changing out there in the world today? A lot of things. Guys, I could be on this slide all day long and say, here are the things that are changing. And these are the areas, the external and the internal factors that are driving the need for organizations to go into high velocity information and technology. The first one, we have a lot of folks out here who are cybersecurity or information security professionals. My kind host does this for a living. But I think that if you look at the fact that we are getting better at protection, the bad actors are also getting more sophisticated. So that's forcing us to be faster because the threat vectors are increasing. So keep that in the back of our minds because I'm going to bring up a little bit on NIST, the cybersecurity framework here in just a little bit as well. Next thing we have is digital transformation. You cannot read a single article out there without somebody talking about digital transformation. This is really all about the investment in innovative technologies, business models, value streams. That's number one is enhancing our customer and user experiences. Too often, Organizations are adopting digital transformation just to be digital, and they're forgetting the fact that they have customer and user experiences that they're supposed to be thinking about. And all the time, we see people adopting these digital transformation efforts, and they're creating vulnerabilities and they're creating risks that they might not have ever thought they had. Of course, my favorite is high velocity IT. And what I'm saying basically here is right now, Agile is hot, DevOps is hot. But don't think that if you're the only organization in the world who hasn't gone down the DevOps path. Everybody will tell you, yeah, we're DevOps. But guys, there are some things you really need to think about from a risk perspective and from a framework perspective. And I'm going to focus a little bit on Agile and DevOps for us here in this presentation, because they're very aggressive deployment techniques. And for most organizations, they can evolve so fast that they can create those vulnerabilities that you never expected you would ever have. And of course, another thing that's really pushing fast IT is things like compliance, a very aggressive compliance. You think about globally, things like GDPR. North America has multiple. Every organization, every country has, and every industry has their own set of compliance requirements. It is mind-blowing, the growth of laws, rules, and regulations that are really coming up right now. And this is tipping that scale between performance and conformance. You cannot be conformant to 100% of every one of these compliance requirements. You have to be able to stay in business. And so this is forcing a lot of organizations to be checklist compliant, which I don't want you to do. I want you to have a framework in place that allows you to have a risk-based approach to looking at how you become compliant. And then, of course, global disruptions. This is making things go fast. 1 year ago, I could have potentially, matter of fact, I believe 1 year ago, I was supposed to be standing in Turkey, right? But things changed. Things changed. The global pandemic, if you think about it, this all started, you think about 9/11 in North America several years ago. All right, that changed, that upended so many practices that businesses were focusing on because travel stopped for quite some time. Security measures increased physically. But now we've got this global pandemic, and it's changing how we work, and it's also changing how we control doing that work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the two types of IT that I mentioned to you earlier, and I call these fast and slow IT. Okay, so first I want to start with this little cartoon. I think this is a great way to kick this piece off. So if you look here, you got this guy coming in, and he's got these packages, and these packages say DevOps and Agile. Everybody loves these things, but this guy over here, he's a little shocked on this. This guy doesn't know what to think. But you've got this manager saying, "Hey, this is our new set of deployment tools. They're supposed to make all of our problems go away." Be careful about this, because if you are going down the path of high velocity or fast IT, just saying we're DevOps or just saying we're Agile is not enough. Guys, if you can't get primary waterfall or SDL approaches at a mature state in your organization, you have no business going down a fast IT approach. So let's take a look at why we have this drive for fast IT. Well, we need to have business agility. You guys know that right now, a single app can destroy an entire industry. A single free app from one company can do that. So the business needs to change. Think about organizations and companies that have gone out of business because they did not stay on top of high velocity. Think about like the movie rental business. We don't see VCR tapes anymore. We rarely see CD-ROMs or DVDs anymore. Everything's online. So things are moving very quickly. And that's really based on the technology progress. Right now, I will tell you that one of my largest concerns right now is IoT. Because everything's moving out there. And so we need to make sure that we can make changes immediately. I don't have time to wait for the next release next quarter. Of course, smaller, more frequent changes to support that business agility. And we're starting to see this increase in working in smaller, more agile and product-oriented teams. And it goes without saying that automation is huge for that. Here's a big one. This is also a big conversation topic that we're seeing out there in the market. And it's talking about external services, right? We cannot operate without vendors. And last I checked, over 87%, depends on where you look, over 87% of the globally newsworthy events where there was PII exposed or there was a breach, somehow a third party was involved. So again, we want to make sure we have a framework that supports us to be able to do that. So let's talk fast and slow IT. And this is what is called bimodal IT. Now, Gartner kicked this thing off a couple of years ago. Gartner really focused on this, and they said there's two types of how we do work, right? And one may be more predictable than the other. And they call that as fast and slow IT. And so if you think about this mode one is what we call fast IT, right? That's fast. And what that is saying is system one says, hey, we're making sure that we're focusing on things that are in front of us now. These are small changes. These may be hundreds of changes in a day. This may be one change a day, but we are doing this as we need it. And what it's really doing is driving us just go ahead and put slow IT. That should be fast. I'm so sorry on that. That one up. So that was actually slow. I messed that one up on us. Okay. Then we got mode two is what we call fast IT. We're experimenting. We're moving on. We're making sure that we are opening areas of uncertainty, and that's kind of the fast IT. The difference here is this. Slow IT you know of as basically a software development lifecycle or systems development lifecycle. Fast IT is where we're starting to see things like Agile and DevOps types of approaches. So anyway, so that's the whole fast and slow IT. So we're trying to create a model here in this discussion today that when we're looking at slow IT versus fast IT, what some things are that might be very important out there. So I got a question that says, hey, what are the factors we should pay attention to in choosing a GRC vendor? Hang on that one in a second, because I've got something in the COBIT framework that actually, I believe they're called governance components that I think are very important that give you some evaluation techniques for that. So hold on that one, because I think that's a really, really good question. Okay. Let's start slow IT. All right, you guys might know this, and slow IT is what we call the SDLC, or sometimes we call it a waterfall approach. So look at this. What happens is we have this long process, and this long process, we're trying to create something. And let's say that could take us, I'm going to make this up. Let's say it's going to take us 9 months, right? It could take us 4 months. It could take us 4 years. But we go through these steps where every one of these steps has to have an approval point. But what happens is we get here and somebody says, oh, something's not right. So we got to go back and do it again. And that's the challenge we run into with slow IT, with the waterfall, because we have clearly defined work phases. This is great for some very large efforts that you can't take small pieces out of. But where we're running into issues with this is because we have to adhere to the same schedule, and we have to adhere to the same cost cycles through that entire project. And our clients and our companies and our stakeholders are saying, that's too long. We need this now. So there's really kind of along the steps of what take place along that waterfall. I'm not saying waterfall is dead. Matter of fact, I'm a huge fan of this. In fact, there are organizations that say we do everything DevOps or we do everything Agile. There may be some projects or initiatives in your organization that, quite honestly, you have to do in a waterfall approach. Now, things are speeding up. People want things fast. I can't wait for 9 months, because in 9 months, the market might have moved past us. So we need to make sure that we look at this from a more aggressive standpoint. So one of the first areas is what we call Agile. Now, this has been around for a couple of decades. Agile really started, there were a few, in fact, a couple of these folks were colleagues of mine. What they did was they put themselves in this conference room at a ski resort in North America. And actually, I think it was in Utah, North America. What they said was, we just want to make software. We just want to develop code. We want to get good. We don't want the burden of all these big steps of that waterfall process. So they came out of this meeting with something called the Agile Manifesto. And a couple of key points of that manifesto said, hey, don't focus on the big, long processes, all that stuff. Just go right to having the teams together in the same room that could create good software and good code. We're not going to worry about all the documentation, drawing the diagrams. We're going to do some modeling, and we're going to produce software. And of course, a key part of this is the client or the core stakeholders that are consuming this software have to be part, or a representative has to be part of this group. But what's nice is now we can accept changes, because if you are familiar with Agile, it might go into these time boxes where it's something called a sprint, where we may have a 2-week or a 3-week sprint. So now we're getting software and we're getting modifications every 2 to 3 weeks, as opposed to every 9 months. That was great. So here's what that kind of looks like. So what it does, it starts out with something called a product backlog that you see here on the left. That product backlog, think about that as a whole list of all the requirements that we want as part of our software. But remember, we're going to do these small sprints. Instead of doing all of these in 9 months, we're going to do only a few of these every 2 to 3 weeks. So there's small incremental chunks. So what happens is we come up with what's called our sprint backlog. And sprint backlog is a style. This is from the flavor of Agile called Scrum. So we have a sprint backlog. Think of each one of these as separate requirements, like a 3x5 card that says, as a blank, my role, I need to blank the task in order to blank the outcome. So we have that sprint backlog, and we go into this thing called a sprint. And once we come out of that sprint, what we have is potentially shippable product or code. So what's nice is I just took a 9-month cycle that does this huge list of things down into smaller 3-week cycles that does a few of these at a time. That was great. But sometimes as your customer, 3 weeks is too long. I need something this afternoon. And I need something that actually is very aggressive. And now we see this thing called DevOps. DevOps is continuous deployment. There's a lot of continuous things in DevOps, but it's going through and saying that, hey, you need this thing done. It's going to be small, but we can do it this afternoon. And that's what DevOps is really looking at. So it really converges that 9-month SDLC cycle into a 3-week sprint. But now it says we're not going to do it in 3 weeks. We're actually going to get it for you this afternoon. So it's very, very fast moving, from what they call fast moving from left to right, and huge feedback from right to left. And I'll talk a little bit about the visual state of this here in just a second. So you do have to have a high trust culture in this, because a key thing here is when I'm deploying, there are organizations, now don't quote me on this, but I think it was either Amazon or Facebook. In a day, they will do literally thousands of changes in a day. And there's an approach to how you do this. And the intent here is not to teach you how to do DevOps, because we want to build a GRC framework for you. So one of the things that we may look at for say DevOps is we need to have some visual ways in how we look at work. And this goes back to the good old-fashioned Kanban board, which looks at that work as it flows from left to right and provides us feedback from right to left. There's a lot of good stuff out there online on DevOps. Again, I just want you to be familiar with the different styles of deployment so we can start looking at the GRC framework that we're building next. All right. So this is one of my favorite slides to talk about when we start building frameworks out there. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about altitudes. Okay. In any organization, you have different governance altitudes. Of course, you have strategic, tactical, operational, and so on. But I want to talk about frameworks. So if you look up at the top, we have enterprise governance, right? That's not just IT governance, right? That's enterprise, that's corporate governance, and a lot of other areas. And then we have IT governance. You guys know there's so many different ways. We've heard governance of enterprise IT. We've heard enterprise governance of information technology. I'm going to call it IT governance for our discussion today. But what happens is people go right to these frameworks, okay? And so up at the top, enterprise governance, what we're trying to do is to build our framework of the enterprise so we can balance performance and conformance, which basically says, look, I mentioned this earlier. If I am overly conformant to everything that I need to be conformant to, my performance is going to suffer. So we have to look at it from a risk perspective. And some examples here for you see performance on the left-hand side. We may use something called the balanced scorecard to help us visualize and understand and communicate the different areas how we report performance. On the conformance side of this level, we may use something. This is primarily North America, but I think globally, a lot of people understand what's called COSO, community sponsoring organizations. But if we can balance those two things, we can be able to create value. So I'm going to skip that middle piece for a second here. I'm going to go right down to the example frameworks because this is what most people do. They go down and they have their favorite framework that's going to save them. They've got ITIL, they've got PMBOK, TOGAF. Now you can replace these with any of your favorite frameworks, but most organizations say, oh yeah, ITIL is going to save us, right? But the problem is they're missing this link right here between enterprise governance and example frameworks. And you guys know what's going to show up next. That's going to be one of my favorites here as soon as I get this thing to load up for us. And there you go. And that is the link between enterprise governance and choosing and selecting the frameworks in your GRC system that are most applicable and appropriate for you. So I like to think of COBIT as a framework to help you manage your frameworks. It's middleware. It's middleware between enterprise governance and defining what parts of those frameworks are out there. So I use an example here on how you even go a step further, because a lot of folks say, well, we're a cybersecurity shop, so we just use the NIST cybersecurity framework, or we just use ISO 27000 series. Well, what you can now do is say put them in the context of a complete ecosystem for yourself. So let's see how that would fit. So let's say you say, okay, COBIT's great, but we're NIST. Well, what I would say is in the NIST cybersecurity framework, now what you do is what COBIT can do is takes your enterprise governance requirements. It can translate which parts of which frameworks are most applicable and appropriate for you. And right there is your governance ecosystem. But what I want to do for you, since we're talking about high velocity environments, I want to take this thing called COBIT. And I want to jump a little bit deeper into that for you on how we can use that for a high velocity environment. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit on the COBIT spotlight. Here's some key points to COBIT 2019. Kind of start with the first. We won't hit every one of these in detail, but the first COBIT, we do have a set of principles. We have governance system principles. You see on the top, we have governance framework principles. Guys, you can go take a look at that. Go see, sit in one of the COBIT courses or out on the ISACA site. A lot of information out there on that information. But here's what I really like. I like these things called components. I think of these components as ingredients to your governance system, right? Every one of my governance system, we have to have processes. We have to have structures. This is going to come up in a few minutes. We have to have information. We have to have people. We've got to have our policies. Have to have culture. We have to have services and our infrastructure and applications. Very key point for us. That's going to come up again here in just a few minutes for us. We also have, as a part of the COBIT launch, we have what are called focus areas. Think of these as, if you might recall back in COBIT 5, I was part of the team that really looked at COBIT 5, and we thought we made COBIT 5 perfect. But what happened was, sometimes perfect can ruin good. We really overdid COBIT 5 because it was great, but nobody had any guidance on how to use COBIT 5 in a specific scenario. And that's what these focus areas are really doing. So we're not going to talk too much in this course, but one of the things that we'll see is this one right here is in progress. It's a focus area called DevOps. And what it does is it takes high velocity IT and says, well, you don't need everything in COBIT. There are certain parts of COBIT that you need to support you from a DevOps perspective. So that's what the focus areas are all about. One of my personal favorites is this one. This is awesome. Man, design factors are huge. We did not give you the information you needed to create a tailorable governance system or governance framework for yourself. Now we have these design factors as part of what's called the design guide. And it takes these factors here. It says, based on your unique organization, based on all of these factors, there are certain parts of your GRC system that are more important than others. There are a lot of things out there. You can go out to YouTube, even on the ISACA site. There's some great videos that talk about how to use the design factors. ISACA also has a downloadable Excel tool that actually helps you look at these factors for your specific organization, and then it will crank out and say, here's the parts of COBIT that are the most applicable for you. Guys, I can't tell you how important that is right now, because if you're using COBIT as the core framework for your GRC platform, if one of these design factors, if one of these factors changes, you need to also alter or modify the parts of your framework or the areas that you are focusing on. That is huge. Think about it, guys. In an organization, compliance requirements can change overnight. GDPR hits the globe. Yep, that's going to change my GRC framework for me. Enterprise goals. We may have a whole new enterprise goal. The CEO or the board has just identified goals that are completely different than last year's goals. Is that going to change my GRC platform? Absolutely. Guys, do yourself a big favor and check that out. Okay. Okay, so there's some key points, but there's one last thing I really like on COBIT. We have these things called governance and management objectives, and each one of these governance and management objectives lines up with a process, and that's what you're looking at here. A bunch of these things, right? So there's a lot of practices, or excuse me, a lot of processes out there. But what I did for you for this presentation, again, you will get a copy of this presentation as well. I went through and I did a lot of research on high velocity IT organizations. These are the ones that are doing more frequent changes, and identified which of these processes seem to have the most applicability to that. And that's what I've highlighted right here for you. I don't expect you to know what each of these are. Again, you can jump into the COBIT, into the Governance and Management Objectives Guide and find out more about each one of these. But what you're looking at, folks, are the processes that I think are the most critical for us. Think about it. Over here at APO 3, we've got Managed Enterprise Architecture. It's key to know your architectural principles before you decide you're moving down a high velocity path. Human resources. We have to have the right skills, knowledge, competencies to support high velocity IT. No surprise here, APO 12, managed risk. Like I mentioned before, as we are moving down a high velocity environment, we are creating risks and we're creating vulnerabilities that we didn't think we'd ever have. Managed programs. Of course, because what are we doing? If we're we're digitally transforming, those are part of programs. I'm going to go down to the bottom here and just add projects to that, BAI 11. Requirements definition, and some of the key ones here is solutions identification and build. Think about this, BAI 3, in a waterfall approach, identify and build solutions was a 9-month process, and we're getting ready to squeeze that down into a 9-hour process. Organizational change is huge because this isn't change control. This is the organization preparing for those changes, but BAI 6 is really about change control. How do we approve changes? I can't, if I'm in a high velocity environment, I cannot wait until the change approval board or the change advisory board next week. I need to make this change in the next 24 hours. I can't wait for that scheduled cab. This one is a huge process for us. And of course, when we deploy, we have to accept and transition. That's going to come up in a little bit. Edge configuration. Then we see over the DSS side, operations, service requests and incidents, manage problems, and of course, performance and conformance monitoring. Again, not trying to put you through a COBIT class, but what I did for you here is I looked at the majority of high velocity or fast moving IT organizations that I work with around the globe. These are the processes that they're focusing on. So check this out. If you don't believe me, this is going to tell you right here. So if you look at the bottom, what I did was I looked at these and said, okay, we have different types of deployment. This dark blue is a traditional style. Remember I said that was more like an SDLC. right? We've got Agile and we've got DevOps. So I went through and looked at those processes that come up a lot for high velocity organizations and how we can build a process framework for that. And here's what I found. BAI 03 had probably the most applicability or the most influence over the success of a high velocity IT organization, and that was called Solutions Identification and Build. We'll look through it a little bit more. Remember, we said the dark blue was traditional, where basically that's the waterfall approach. Pretty low numbers right there, but look at Agile and then look at DevOps. So what we're going to do for the rest of well, for probably just the next 10 to 15 minutes on this one is we're going to take a look at this thing called Managed Solutions Identification and Build, BAI 3. Now, you could look at any one of these other processes here because COBIT is huge and COBIT has information on each one. We're going to focus on just this one for you. So if you go back to see, well, what was he talking about? BAI 3, that's the one sitting right here in what we call the COBIT core. Remember, those are the 40 governance and management objectives, and each one of those relates to a process. So let's see what this process is all about, because based on my research, this is going to have a huge effect on your ability to support your framework for GRC. So in BAI 3, it says, hey, we're going to establish and maintain identified products and services. I've highlighted a couple pieces here that are important. We're going to design, develop, procure and source, and partnering with vendors. Do you think that's important in a high velocity environment? Absolutely is. It's all about the partnering now and not these long, huge sourcing relationships. We need to make sure we have agile and scalable delivery of digital products and services. That's our purpose statement. And here's what you're going to like. So we have these things called management practices. By the way, if you are an auditor, these management practices are what you may remember way back in COBIT 4. You remember these as control objectives. So there's going to be a link for us if we're an auditor. So we have these practices, and these practices, as a part of your framework, I need to somehow make sure I'm hitting those practices. And we're going to focus right here on this one called BAI 03.08. So remember, BAI 03, we said that was Managed Solutions Identification and Build. 03.08 is the 8th practice, and it's also supported by a bunch of activities. So I'm going to take this and let's explode this one out. And let's just take this one practice and see what COBIT says about that one practice. What we want to do is we want to undertake testing solutions and their components. All right, so that's part of that single practice. So these are what we call activities sitting down here, okay? So we want to make sure we use clearly defined test instructions, right? We have a test plan, those things in place for us, and undertake all those tests based on those practices, the best practices we have in place. Identify, log, and classify those errors during testing and record testing outcomes. So let's sit on this for a second here. Okay, because this is a process. If you look at 1 through 5, people will say that's a waterfall approach. That's going to take too much time because we have this testing window out there. Not the case, guys. COBIT is basically telling us, as a part of our GRC framework, is saying you need to actually do these things, and we're not telling you how much time it should take, and we're not telling you exactly who should be doing it, but we're telling you to have these things in place for it. So what I did is I wanted to take a step further into this called solution. This thing called solution testing, and say, how would I look at this from the 3 different perspectives from fast and slow IT? So here's what we've got. Is if you look at this, we had a couple of activities here on the bottom on the left-hand side. Okay, those are those activities we talked. Well, actually, there we go. So I've got some activities for us there that we have. What COBIT said is we're going to basically test solutions and their components. Well, I would do that for fast or slow IT. I would have clearly defined test instructions. Doesn't matter if I'm fast or slow IT, it will do it. Do my tests, check my errors during my testing, and record my outcomes. Okay, got it. So far, those are those activities for this. So how would I control that? What is a waterfall approach to testing? Well, what we're going to do is we have an isolated testing phase. You guys know, like we have these steps. We have these big steps where we'll design, build, we'll test, we'll deploy, and we're doing it with hundreds of changes. But now what we're doing is we're doing it with just one or two small changes, and we're doing it throughout the entire effort, not just during a single phase. You guys know we always have issues with environment issues when you're doing a big, long waterfall process. Because how many people out there can say, yeah, we've gone through, we've done a test in a test environment, and all of a sudden we have errors in the test environment? Well, that's because the test environment, or excuse me, let's say different scenario. Let's say we tested in our test environment, had no issues. We deploy to production and have issues. And our stakeholders say, why are we having issues in production? It passed all of your tests. Well, it might be because the test environments did not look and smell just like the production environments. So we have some issues there. So again, it's generally very manual. And then what we do is this entire test phase and report our results. Well, how would we want to do that during a more aggressive, high velocity environment? Well, Agile. Now we integrate testing through the entire cycle, focuses on that software, like we said earlier, and it has to have the customer involved. One of the things in this Agile is we have somebody called a product owner, and that product owner is the customer representative. Very good for small projects. We're testing throughout this, and then we do something called regression testing. Anytime we do a new function, regression says, hey, we're putting something new in the environment. It's not real big, but we want to make sure it doesn't break something that currently is working in a live environment. It does give us continuous feedback. And remember the Agile, we said that's usually going to be between a 2 and a 3 week type of deployment. Within DevOps, what we say is, hey, we're going to automate this stuff. Now, in order to be down this path, you do have to be very, very technology enabled. So let's see, some of them, AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft's Azure, a lot of different environments out there. But what this does is now allows you to build an environment as you're going through what we call the stack. You can automatically build a test environment that looks just like the production environment. And when you're done in that test environment, that environment goes away. You crush those servers, you destroy that environment because you don't need that environment anymore. And that's what that whole automated configuration is about. So part of my GRC framework says I need to make sure I'm focusing on the different processes that support these things. We need to talk about testing and the integration between dev and operation, but this is interesting here. I like this one because if we find something in test, we can fix it immediately, go back, retest this, and I can still have your change in your production environment by 6 o'clock tonight. So I know I've jumped in pretty deep, but remember what we're trying to do is build that GRC framework, looking at multiple pieces out there, but I'm focusing specifically right now just for the COVID piece on this. Okay, so let's jump into this thing called risk-based assurance. So what we've talked about so far is we've said we've got a lot of fast-moving organizations out there. We need to have a framework in place to allow us to make modifications and changes. And I focused a little bit more on the COBIT framework, specifically the design factors and a couple of the processes. Now, how do we make sure that we have assurance over our process? Now, don't confuse assurance and audit. Audit is the test. It's the inspection. Assurance is the overall program that says, do we have these things in place? So I like this when we talk about risk-based assurance. You've got this guy, he's going through a risk assessment by this auditor over here, okay? And he's sitting on this box of dynamite. He's got sharks around him. He's got fire. He's got poisonous snakes. He's got all kinds of things getting ready to happen to him. And he's like, hey, I'm not sure what you mean by a high-risk environment, right? This guy he's not paying attention to any of his risks. And I don't want this to be you, because I want you to make sure you're looking at the risks of going down into a high velocity environment, because you may be creating all these risks and never knew that they were out there for you. So suggested methodology for you from an assurance perspective, okay? By the way, the information you see here is also supported by a general methodology from ISACA. We said, okay, we got a couple of phases out there. We need to know who our stakeholders are. We need to come up with the objectives and the scope of our audit for this high velocity environment. Guys, this is where I would use those design factors that I showed you a minute ago. Think about this. If I'm going to design a GRC framework based on design factors, what were some of those factors? Let's think about it. We talked about enterprise strategy. We talked about our enterprise goals. We talked about our enterprise risks. We talked about pain points in IT. We talked about how we purchase technology, how we deploy technology, what our threat environment is, what our compliance environment is. So we got all these factors out there that will really help us focus on this. The big problem I see is my internal or audit groups are going out and they're doing audits based on their risk analysis, not an enterprise risk analysis. So I had a CEO one time slapped his hand on the table. I was the CIO of this organization, smacks his hand on the table, and he says, why are we losing business? Why are we going out of business? And we're the most secured company in the world. Let that sink in for a second. Now, we were not going out of business, but we were losing some major clients. And he's like, how could this happen? We're secured. We're passing all of our audits. The problem is this, is all we ever audited was information security. As it turns out, our biggest risks were not information security. They were things like relationship management and things like service level management and those types of things. So make sure you understand that all those factors might help you out, and you can find that, of course, out on the ISACA site. It's really cool stuff out there. Next, we want to make sure that we set up our assessment criteria. Guys, this is where I go to COBIT. If you are an auditor, right, you have a huge list of multiple auditing frameworks or auditing guidance out there that I'll show you here in just a second. But start with COBIT practices. We just took a look at one of the processes in COBIT. It had practices and activities, and that can give you the things you need to be able to conduct that audit and perform your assessment. And then, of course, finally, you communicate and you document this information, okay? But what's important here is when you do this, when you're communicating the results of the audit, you want to link that back to the goals. And where can you find that? You can find that in something that we called earlier called the goals cascade, okay? So some of these audit and assurance programs out there, if you haven't seen any of these things, guys, go out to the ISACA site. These are already done for you. When we're talking about creating frameworks for governance, risk, and compliance, and you need some type of assurance or audit program, they're out there. They're out there. I mean, think about it. We've got audit programs for application containers, and that's really a lot of background on, say, going DevOps. Cloud computing, there's a huge one right there. Risk management, AWS. I've got another slide here that just shows all of the references and audit programs you can find out on the ISACA site. All right, we already talked about things like cloud computing out there. We've got one for outsourcing. Right, we've got one for, obviously, for VPN, some basic things on that, data privacy. There's some huge ones out here. So do yourself a big favor and go out and find that information. But like I mentioned to you earlier, I think it's you really should focus a lot first on, again, I'm not trying to sell you guys on COBIT, but you guys know that I think it's a huge benefit for any organization to look at that. So since we're talking about the reference and the audit programs, kind of where you find some of this information, you can go out to the resources site out at ISACA. But do you want to pull something over here, just kind of show you? So a lot of people say, well, where do we find all this stuff that you're talking about out on COBIT? Go out to the ISACA site, highlight over resources tab. And you highlight over resources, you see a thing called COBIT. Just go ahead and click right there on COBIT. And as you go down here, publications. So go right to, in the banner, you see a banner thing called publications. Oh, hey, look at that guy. You probably don't recognize me with a beard on, but I look a lot different. I apologize for that. Sorry. So my beard will be gone in a couple of weeks. So click on publications and Remember, we talked a little bit about some of the COVID focus areas. There's one here for cybersecurity, but some of the key documents I think you really should look at is this COVID 2019 framework. That's the introduction methodology guide. But the one that I got most of my information out for this presentation was right here, governance and management objectives. What that does, it takes all of those 40 governance and management objectives that should be part of your framework, and it describes in detail the suggested practices and activities. The next one I want you to take a look at is this thing called the design guide. It has those design factors in it. Remember, those design factors can help you create a tailored GRC or governance system for your organization. And as those factors change, because we're in a high velocity environment, you can modify your framework as well. Of course, we have the implementation guide. Other documents out there, the implementation of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I talked about a little bit of the link on that. I truly believe that COBIT and the NIST CSF have a huge connection, and I really like how those two come together. So I just want to show you a little bit on that piece. So I know we're getting down to about 10 minutes left, but I did get a question that says, hey, to what degree of documentation in Fast IT is sufficient for IT audit? That's a good one. So I don't have a sliding scale that describes it to you, but I can tell you this is in Fast IT. During my audits in Fast IT, I'm not requiring you to have a document. I'm requiring to be able to see in your system how you are controlling who had access to that change, who made the approval to that change, when that change was conducted, how the details and the configuration of that change are recorded in your system, and that's what I'm looking for. So when you say the degree of documentation, remember in COVID, it's going to give me these control objectives, or what we call practices, and it has activities. Those practices and activities are not coming out and saying, here's the degree of documentation you have. What is your comfort level that you believe the right person did the right work with the right approval, right? And it was the right change for the right customers. So that's kind of the idea, because in Fast IT, I can't produce you a Word document for that. It's in some type of system. And again, a lot of the, I won't go through all the tools that are part of DevOps, but you guys have probably heard of several of them that do keep track of those things. So from an auditor's perspective, it scared us. It scared us when people started going down DevOps, because now I had a Word document that had a signature on it that gave permission for somebody to do something. Now, right, we have what are called organizational structures or delegations of authority that are identified and put directly into systems. So that's always a tough one. That's a good question though. Okay. So a couple of the tips that I have for you guys, and then we'll go out and see if you guys have any other questions out there for me, is number one, guys, resist the urge to be checklist compliant. What I've tried to do today for you is say, have a framework. And by the way, have multiple frameworks out there, but use COBIT as the framework that can manage your frameworks. And therefore, you can look at the areas or the different checklists that you need to have. Don't go out and just be checklist compliant, because if you do that, I can guarantee your performance will suffer. As I mentioned before, COBIT is a great framework to manage your frameworks, as we've seen. I really liked how it integrates it integrates NIST, it integrates ITIL if you're an ITIL shop, multiple other standards and frameworks, including ISO standards as well, and the 27,000 series for security. Guys, this is awesome. Those design factors. I wish we could have just had an additional little bit of time so I could walk through this design factor guide. But this is pretty. I would consider it basic COBIT information that you can find out on the website and so on. But those design factors, remember, those are those factors that if they change based on your high velocity environment, if they change, it could modify how your governance system is in place. I really like that on that one. So I did get a question on, hey, is there a capability model applicable for fast and slow IT? I tell you what, you guys are going to think that I've gone crazy, but the CMMI model still is applicable. CMM. We still are using the CMM model in fast IT environments. Like I said, we're taking the SDLC piece out and looking at it from a fast perspective. The capability maturity model integrated is what that is. I would still look at that from fast and slow IT. There are some other. I'm trying to think. There's another group. I'll try to think of it before we're finished up, that focus on measurement techniques in Agile and DevOps, but I don't remember the name of them. So, but anyway, I would still focus on the CMM model. It's still applicable for fast IT. Okay, so we talk about the holistic approach to auditing. Like I said, is don't just focus on checklists, right? There are many components out there to help us look from an auditing perspective. And guys, in fast IT, you have to do this. What we do is when we delegate a level of authority, which basically, if you're familiar with things called standard changes, right? It's relatively low risk. It's well understood. I can nominate you as the local authority because I don't want you to have to go to this board or this committee every time you need to do this change. I need you to be able to make that change, and you make it fast as long as it meets certain criteria. Okay. And then finally, always be aware of those emerging risks, guys. This is not slowing down. These emerging risks, because one of the emerging risks right now is the movement to high velocity IT. Because as we mentioned, we're creating vulnerabilities that we did not know we would ever have by creating these, but we keep an eye on those things. And now we can adjust that GRC framework we have. Remember, that GRC framework is going to be based on those design factors in COBIT, and COBIT's going to help us say which parts of which frameworks should you be looking at high velocity IT. Guys, you'll get a copy of this presentation because I know I gave you a lot of info, but go back and look at the research that I did. And I said, these processes are going to be very important for you in a high velocity environment, and therefore how you might be able to break each one of them down and use COBIT to help you do that stuff. Okay. All right. So like I said, I know you probably, and I shouldn't say this out loud, I put so much information in here for you. You should probably get more than normal CPE for this, right? So anyway, I appreciate you guys spending time with me today. And again, you get a copy of this information as well, and the recording of this will be out on YouTube. So let's take a look here. A couple things I want you guys to do. Please feel free to go out, and I'd like for you guys to do the survey because that helps us as an association bring you more relevant and pertinent information that helps you and your career grow. So if there's something about about what we talked about today you didn't like, let us know. That way we can modify that in the future for you guys too. So I'll put it back to the leadership here in a second, but I'm going to open this up and see, keep an eye out on the chat window here and see if you guys have any questions for me.
Yes, Mark, we have some questions. Second. It's asked that to what degree of documentation is fast IT sufficient for audit?
Oh, got that one. So I saw that one a little bit earlier. So I was able to answer that one. That's when we talked about having that information in the system as opposed to a document. So I was able to catch that one earlier. And I hope that was, yep. And I hope I didn't mess the name of Burko. Said good answer. Got it. I did see another one out there says capability model for fast and slow IT. We talked about CMMI on that one. So I think I got most of them. All right.
Yeah, Mark, actually, you catch all the questions, and I have one more question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that in that fast IT environment, and we don't have classical Word documentations, but we have that records on the DevOps tools. Mm-hmm. Do you know any kind of technology, methodology, or any new cutting-edge thing to make make automation for that controls? Because rather than Word documents, now we have that logs and we can leverage that automation on there.
Yeah. So, guys, so what's so interesting is I could give some recommendations on some, but the automation and the tools right now there are so the list is so massive right now. So if you think, I don't have it sitting in front of me, but tell you what I may do is I'll go out and take a look at some of the latest tools, and I might be able to provide those back, and maybe you can share those back to the group, because it just depends on where we're auditing. Are we auditing for so like Sec DevOps or DevSecOps, where we have security built into the entire system, or are we looking at it from just a post implementation? So I don't have any examples of tools off the top of my head for you, but I can get some for you. I apologize for not having that answer.
No worries. It's
Sure.
totally okay.
Sure. Great question. Mehmet says, hey, some guides like 2019 DevOps document has not been published yet. You know, will be published. So I can't tell you the exact date. We were kind of hoping it would be out by now. I'm actually on that group of the DevOps focus area guide. So I can tell you guys this is you guys know when we're building these guides, people are volunteering our time. We have volunteers from around the world doing this. So the first challenge is, as you can imagine, getting experts from around the world to all agree on a single way of communicating is the first difficult part. But the second thing is it's getting the volunteer time. Right now, I do know that that document is in progress. It is in draft form. So if I gave you a date, I'd be making it up, because I don't know that. It's not even us on the team. We do have a final editing that needs to go through on that. So be prepared. The DevOps document will be coming. I just don't have that final date for you. If I had to guess, I'd guess in the next 3 to 6 months, but that is not official ISACA publication for you. So
Mark, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned about goals cascade. Can you explain more about goals cascade, because that is a tough area?
Yep. Okay, I sure can. So actually, let me do this. Let me do something here. Let me. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add another blank slide here to this, since this is on. Being recorded. So we talk about the goals cascade. So here's kind of what's happened here is and COBIT does this for us. COBIT actually has a series of what we call enterprise goals. Okay. And these are generic level goals that every organization kind of looks at. And there's 13 of them. Okay. And so we have these enterprise goals that say, okay, the organization needs to do these things. But what we did is we also have a set of what we call alignment goals. And these alignment goals are what we previously knew as IT related goals. So we have these alignment goals out here, 13 of those. And what we did is we said, okay, we need to link these alignment and these enterprise goals. So if you're my CEO and you say, Mark, this enterprise goal right here is the most important goal for me. What we did in COBIT is we linked that down to the most important alignment goals that it links to. So in order for me to meet that enterprise goal, I know I need to meet these goals here. So there's a connection between this, and these are in a series of tables. They're in the COBIT documentation. But what's really interesting is we link those down into what we call governance and management objectives. And those governance and management objectives are also processes too. So we've got all these processes. We've got 40 processes out there, right, in the COBIT framework. So what this also does is takes each one of those alignment goals and it will map those to certain processes. So the idea is this: if you tell me this is the most important goal at the enterprise level, I now know the most important alignment goals I need to meet, and now I also know the most important governance and management objectives I need to meet. So I'm kind of doing a visual kind of effect for you, but it's really nice because there's a set of tables out in the COBIT methodology guide that really kind of walk through each one of those. And what's interesting is as your goals change, so you may, in 6 months from now, this is no longer our goal. This is our goal. And it could completely modify the alignment goals and the governance and management objectives that we're focusing on. There is, I think, out on YouTube. I may send you guys this link. On YouTube, I do have a short video that kind of talks through the use of the COVID goals cascade that might be pretty helpful. So anyway, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank
Is
you.
there any question, attendees? Because I have another question.
Okay.
Okay. Mark, you explained, of course, one of our attendees.
Sorry. Yeah. Can I ask directly? Hello, Mark. May I please ask you to give some information about how to cope with the challenge or segregation of duties within DevSecOps?
Yep. So on delegation. So if you think about this, so in an organization that I worked with here recently, they had what they called a standard change list. Okay, and that standard change list was their delegations of authority document. They had about, and these were for IT specific changes. They had about 3,000 of these things. And there was so you don't just come up with a list of 3,000 delegation of authority items. It takes some time to do that. But what they did is they had just a separate group that managed this list for them. And in this delegation of authority document, it was basically a big matrix. And what it said is there are certain activities that IT professionals are doing when they're deploying a product or a service or modification or production. So 3,000 of these things. And then what it had was the level of authority, which role was allowed to do this. But then when you clicked into it, it said, even though that role has the authority to do this, what are the rules or what are the criteria in which that role can now do it? So, for example, that role can only make these changes during on weekends only. That role can only make these changes if there are no scheduled modifications to that technology in the next 48 hours. That role can only make those changes if these attributes or these criteria actually come up. Again, I told you I wasn't going to talk a lot about the tools, but these guys used a service management tool called ServiceNow to do that actually. So that's the key thing is, what are those tasks that need to be done? So, for example, I have a DevOps engineer who needs to deploy. He needs to go from a blue to green, a green to blue environment. Basically, something needs to go live. He has the authority to do that as long as the following things have been done. He's checked his code into what's called the trunk. That trunk has been peer reviewed. And if that's done, he now has the authority to do that. So that's what I would suggest for you. It's a huge, huge effort. And I will tell you that 90% of the organizations that I visit, it's all ad hoc. It's not formal, and it's not put into a system, and it's based on something that IT creates, not without business supporting that. So I think that's pretty key. Hopefully that helps you.
I think so. Let me check with my colleagues. Thank you.
Yep, sure.
Thank you, Sema. I have another question for you, Mark. You explained how an GRC project will succeed its mission, but as I see, a pretty good number of GRC projects fail. Can you explain some main factors a GRC project do fail? Why a GRC project do fail?
I'll tell you, the first one right off the bat is that an enterprise is telling IT to do it. They're saying, IT, create IT governance. And you guys know that IT cannot govern itself, because if you ask me to govern myself, what you've just asked me to do is create my own rules, right? Determine which of my own rules I choose to follow, and then determine the consequences for those rules that I choose to break. So the first thing that I see is when people are putting GRC frameworks together, they're pushing it off saying that's an IT thing, and that's not the case. It has to be governed by the enterprise. The second thing I would say is when you look at ensuring benefits delivery. A lot of people start to slam in these frameworks because it's going to save their company. And I'm telling you some frameworks out there that I think are good, but what's the benefit? Okay, what do we think we're going to get out of this? And organizations don't understand that the positive impact or the benefits of a governance framework, they're not going to show up tomorrow. They're not going to be there next month. It takes months, quarters, and possibly years for a governance framework to actually show your real benefits, because you want to show benefits to things like profitability and that kind of stuff. So I would suggest so to specifically answer that question from a COBIT perspective, the process that I would refer to would be EDM 02, which is ensured benefits delivery. What are the benefits we're going to get out of this, and what do we expect on that? So I think that's a huge one. But again, the first one is this should not be delegated to IT. But I would look at EDM 02. Of course, EDM, anything in EDM would be helpful on that. But AP01, which is manage the IT framework, would also be pretty helpful there too.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure. All right, guys. If there's no other questions, what I'll do is I'll follow up. Let's see, GSC question, but ERM or GRC? Oh, okay. So the question is IRM, ERM, or GRC. So I would say, what I would say is GRC is your overarching model. Okay. Under GRC, remember the R stands for risk, right? So that's going to have our IRM, that would have ERM, that kind of stuff. So I would say your overarching view is this: governance, risk, and compliance at the enterprise level. And then under that, you would have your specific risk, like the C would be compliance and so on. So that's so Mehmet, hopefully that one answered that one for you. So that's the way we're seeing it taking place right now in the market. Okay. All right, guys, I'm going to send it back to chapter leadership, and you guys can kind of finish this up, and I can get some slides to you too, so you can distribute later on.
Thank you, Mark Thomas. You had a great webinar.
Thank you.
And thank you all attendees. Do you have another question? I'm asking for the last time. Sefa?
If you don't have any, actually, I can steal the slot. Mark, you mentioned that IT is the most of the time responsible for implementing this GRC, and that is the one of the reason for that fail. What kind of operating model do you suggest?
Oh, yeah.
At the high level, yeah.
Yeah. So here's the background on this, and this happened to me as a CIO. Is I actually got called to talk to the board because we had a major incident that took place, and so the board asked me, well, what do we need to do? And I said, we need to be governed. Here's what happened: is the board, or the highest operating group of the organization, that governs the organization, my board, it operated through the use of committees, right? The compensation committee, the risk committee, audit committee, right? Those types of things. So the only two committees that discussed IT with my board were the audit committee and the risk committee. Now, how often are the audit and risk committees going to my board saying IT is awesome? No, they're talking about audit findings, and they're talking about technology risks. There was not a committee that talked to the board about governing enterprise IT. They thought that the audit committee was how we governed IT. I'm like, that's not it, right? That is an assurance effort. So what I would suggest from a high-level operating model is, what is the committee? How do you talk to your board about IT governance? And it could be an IT governance committee, and that's what we did. We had a separate committee on IT governance that actually, it was a GRC committee that talked IT governance, IT risk, and IT compliance. That now the board had a way of understanding that IT's contribution to the enterprise. So I would look at that first. How does IT from management perspective interact with the board? In my case, they didn't. The only thing that the board knew about my organization was the negative side, the risks and those kinds of things. So that's the first thing I would suggest on that. The other thing is as you have committees. One of the challenges that you run into when you look at frameworks like COBIT is you think that governance is only the board of directors and management is everyone else. But I need to emphasize this: is wherever you are in an organization, there will always be a governing body above you of some type. So, for example, as a CIO, I had two governing bodies as a CIO that influenced my decisions. One was the board of directors. Number two was the executive steering committee. Well, the executive steering committee was management, but it was still a governing body. You may have a change advisory board or a change control board. Well, it's not the board of directors, but it's still a governing body. So I would suggest doing an inventory of your governing bodies and say, what are they governing and which higher governing body is giving them their direction? And that is probably one of the biggest challenges I see, especially with international organizations, that they don't know. Well, they have governing bodies that are ad hoc governing bodies that have no charter. And they don't know what their scope is, but those governing bodies are the ones, to go back to a question I was asked earlier, they're the ones that are assigning delegation rights and delegation authorities. So it's the link between IT and the board through some type of IT governance committee, and then how does that committee link to other governing bodies throughout IT is what I would suggest.
Yeah, thanks for the answer, Tom.
Sure.
Nice. Is there anyone who has a question? They can type into chats, or I think we actually are running over the time.
Yes.
Actually, I
okay
have time. It's okay for me, but
it's
it's
okay with
all
me.
about your calendar.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Mark, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I've enjoyed our conversation. This has been very cool. Thank you so much.
We are waiting for your slides too.
Yep. So I have another webinar that I'm 16 minutes late for, but as soon as I get off that one, I'll get those to you. It'll be a PDF, and I'll have those sent out to you guys.
Okay. Thank you all our attendees. Now we are ending our webinar. See you on our next session on Wednesday next week. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate
you for bringing order the chaos.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, guys. Hey, I'll reach back out to you. I'm going to jump off on that next webinar.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Sounds good.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.